her bio here. She's running the Human Rights Institute at the University of Connecticut. She's also teaching at the University of Connecticut. She has a wide range of research, really looking at women and children and issues of vulnerability. She is focusing on migration in her most current research. But more than that, she is one of those voices that can bring us all together. So we are louder, and we really speak to women's rights. So this morning, I don't want to take up more of her time, but you will hear Catherine Leibel, and I'm very, very pleased to have her here, talking about the situation of women migrants and how is employment helping or not helping them, and what are some of the issues we need to talk about and make sure that this kind of dialogue doesn't end here. Catherine.
It might have gotten close, but I can put it up, Marciana.
You think? It's
Yeah.
closer than this one?
No.
Okay.
That's, let's see here. I think it's here.
Oh.
Oh, no, that's not mine. Let's see.
That's another one.
My vision, sorry.
Okay.
I think it's over there.
Yes, CSW is the second one.
Maybe this
It's
one?
this one, I think. Right?
No, that's another one. Oh, yes.
Yes,
that
this
is.
is.
Okay, so you're going to have to excuse me as I move between glasses. So if I put this pair of glasses on, I can't see you very well, and I definitely want to see you. And I'm just delighted to be here today. Fordham is a leader in human rights education and in social work, and so it's an absolute pleasure to be amongst colleagues and students and others from the community who are a part of such an important program within our country. And I should just say that while I've worked in Turkey initially, looking at issues of child welfare and the emergence of child welfare practices in the 1930s and 40s, and also have looked at the politics of humanitarian assistance for Iraqi refugees back in between 2007 and 2011, the project I'll talk to you a bit about today is a newer project, and it's building on that work with Iraqi refugees. I also, though, think that when we talk about human rights, we have to talk about human rights very close to home. And in fact, I've been encouraged by colleagues and friends who have met in the Middle East that really a lot of work needs to be done in the US, and that will have ripple effects that are very positive for people in other parts of the world, especially in terms of our foreign policy and the kinds of decisions that our executive branch makes. And I think it's really important to note right now that our voices are needed in order to press the current administration and Congress not to make the massive cuts that they're proposing, both to the State Department and to the United Nations and to many of the NGOs and organizations that we know are supported by the work around gender justice. Yes, and that goes without saying. I was very troubled this week to see that the initial proposal for cuts to the State Department were 38% of that department's budget, just recognizing what that would mean for so many of the programs that actually are trying to affect women's economic empowerment, especially in terms of those who are forced to migrate. So I want to thank faculty and staff at the Fordham Graduate School of Social Service for your efforts to organize this 14th annual symposium on migration and women's rights, and especially thanks are owed to Associate Dean Elaine Congress and Dr. Marciana Popescu for their hospitality, as well as to Professor Sandy Turner, who's the director of the Women and Girls Institute. It's a dynamic time to be speaking about women's rights and migration. In the past 2 years, the Sustainable Development Goals were launched, and high-level efforts to address the challenges of large-scale migration have been initiated. As Leisha Beardmore, Sustainable Development and Climate Advisor to the UN, recently stated, quote, "Forced migration, whether induced by climate change, disasters, or violence, carries huge implications for the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals." Attending to gender, and particularly to the lives of girls and women in large-scale migration, is also a priority for human rights and development advocates, as is evident in a number of the events related to this year's Commission on the Status of Women meetings over these 2 weeks. Addressing women's economic empowerment, including both educational and employment aspects, is critical. Yet social workers, educators, humanitarian and community development workers, and legal aid advocates have much to do to foster this economic empowerment. And building on Marciana's early comments, our work is great. We are needed in solidarity, particularly amongst refugees who reside in host countries that have limited capacity to offer robust education, training, and work opportunities. We also have great obligations to be involved in advocacy here to make sure that new walls to resettlement aren't created under our watch. So, of course, I'm referring to the 2 executive orders that are having profound implications for refugees who are set to arrive in the next few months and in the years to come. So in this talk, I'll highlight the particular challenges of addressing women's economic empowerment in situations of large-scale forced migration, but I'll focus on Syrian forced migrants or refugees in the Middle East, and in particular in Jordan. These challenges can, of course, be seen in Turkey, Lebanon, Europe, and the United States as well, as will be apparent in the panel presentations to follow. A couple of caveats are necessary to make. First, we don't have an adequate language to capture what large-scale movements mean. Often we'll see phrases like the Syrian refugee situation, perhaps out of tiredness of saying crisis, 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 or emergency. It's a matter of enormous scale, involving many countries and millions of Syrians. Crisis, emergency, and situation are all variously used in media and scholarly accounts. And now, more than 6 years after war broke out in Syria, crises, or emergencies, have become chronic everyday matters. As the years stretch on, women and their families must grapple with the limbo created by war and displacement in locales that are ill-equipped to secure their rights, including, most importantly, I would argue, economic and social rights. A second caveat is that while I'm drawing on the Syrian case, Iraqis, Afghans, Somalis, Pakistanis, and others from many parts of the world are part of the broader migration process that's precipitated this notion that there's a crisis in Europe and in Middle East countries. So this morning I'll outline the international institutional context related to the rights of refugees and migrants, and this may be familiar to some of you, but compared to 2005, 2006, 2007, when mass migration of Iraqis was happening, there's a much greater attention to this issue at an international level than I observed in that earlier era. Camps and neighborhoods where Syrian refugee women and families live are sites of economic activity. But for this to meaningfully provide women's and their families' basic needs, current approaches would need to be scaled up considerably, and legal authorization to work would need to be truly attainable for most. And even then, we have to recognize this, even then, self-sufficiency, or the ability to secure a family's economic well-being may not be realistic for most refugees. I will also focus on camp-based approaches in Jordan, so we're going to hone in on that toward the latter part of the talk, stressing the current workfare programs, which will seem familiar to some of you, and the way in which they provide a pathway to work but are inadequate. Livelihood approaches in camps remain underfunded and relatively limited, as well as narrow in the range of employment opportunities available. At the end of the talk, I ask us to consider social work's role across transnational borders in fostering both local and global action. This work would importantly imagine how to scale up women's economic empowerment initiatives, but would also press for structural supports that secure the basic conditions of dignified living: access to housing, healthcare, education, food, sanitation, and water, justice, and mobility. In other words, social, economic, and civil rights. So these reflections today are based on insights gained while in Jordan during several summer trips in the late 2000s, research where I was researching humanitarian aid for Iraqi refugees, a short trip to Jordan in summer 2016, an extensive review of camp documentation for both Zaatari and Azraq, and you should check out the UNHCR websites. It's incredible the amount of data that's actually archived there, including data from folks groups and every aspect of life that you can imagine, as well as looking at reports by national and international NGOs and UN agencies. And I won't say much about this, but the background of interest in this work really comes from a place of macro-social work practice and an interest in thinking about human rights advocacy as a form of policy practice. So recent UN work on large movements of refugees and migrants has provided a new focus on refugee rights. The 2016 New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants, which was adopted during a UN summit on refugees in September of 2016, reaffirms obligations by states and the international community to respect and protect, quote, the human rights of all refugees and migrants, regardless of status. All are rights holders. And who here had an opportunity to attend any of the events that were coinciding with the summit? Yeah, what an incredible privilege to be here in this city during that important time. The declaration defines large movements of refugees and migrants as reflecting, quote, a number of conditions, including the number of people arriving, the economic, social, and geographical context, the capacity of a receiving state to respond, and this is important to hold in mind, and the impact of a movement that is sudden or prolonged. This New York Declaration is an important step in signaling that the international community must develop deeper and more effective forms of cooperation on mass migration. And these statements are being made often today in much more powerful and extensive ways than they were a decade ago. Yet, I think without our work, these statements will remain just statements. So I just highlighted one quote. If you haven't had a chance to read the New York Declaration, I recommend doing so. It's a pretty long document, about 20 pages, and there is a direct call to action for people engaged in social work, academics, and others like you, and a stress on the importance of international cooperation needed to assist host communities and countries. One thing I'd like to emphasize, which isn't said enough, and I think especially in the context of all the media coverage of the migration crisis in Europe, is that the neighboring host countries are most affected by mass displacement. This doesn't minimize the impact in the Syrian example of migrants and refugees seeking refuge in Europe, but it has to be understood that Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan have borne the majority of the responsibility for hosting Syrians. This is a declaration, so it's not a piece of binding international human rights law at this point. There is a move toward a global compact, which I'll mention just briefly later. But under President Obama, we did sign on and agree to participate in this declaration.
And could the U.S. withdraw if, say, the President Obama?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there are mechanisms in terms of binding international human rights law where we already have obligations. So we joined the Refugee Convention. Clearly there are moves being made by the current administration to potentially even shut down refugee resettlement to the U.S. So this is a deeply, deeply politicized issue. But good question. Thank you. So this is an initial step in recognizing the challenges of large-scale migration. And obviously, there's a much broader conversation going on about the impacts of climate change, economic crises, and other push factors that might impel people to move in large numbers. The UN's involved in a sustained process over this year and next to craft a global compact for what they call safe, orderly, and regular migration. The Global Migration Group, key UN agencies, state and non-governmental actors are pressing to identify innovative and effective means of balancing emergency conditions versus long-term realities of large-scale displacement, such as in the Iraqi case that we know in the recent past, as well as in the Syrian case currently. So it's in this broader institutional context that we must think about refugee women's economic empowerment. And based on the case of Syrian women in camps and host communities in Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, and in reception centers, as they're called, in Greece and other parts of Europe, the international community, including social workers engaged in direct service, administration, and advocacy, have considerable work to do. So I just want to highlight the Global Coalition on Migration, which is a coalition of migrant rights organizations that are really coming from a standpoint of the voices of migrants themselves. They're active here at the Commission on the Status of Women. They've already presented this week. They recently made a statement to press the Human Rights Council of the UN to recognize the human rights of migrants and to take on a migrant-centered perspective. So the quote here, in order to identify promising practices on the protection of human rights of migrants in vulnerable situations, it is central to recognize that first and foremost, migrants are rights holders at all times, whether they are in transit, at the border, or in any country. And this indeed is one of the most challenging facets of the solidarity work that social work and other allied professionals might do, is to how to find the ways in which migrants, and in particular refugees who are in very constrained circumstances, to find a political voice, to be able to make claims for their rights, which are often quite constrained because governments become nervous when people who are guests or in their hopes temporarily residing there start to be political actors. Just as another example of how high level some of these conversations are, and how important it is actually that the committees that monitor various human rights treaties are starting to work closely with UNHCR on refugee rights. There was a joint statement from the committee that oversees the Migrant Workers Treaty, CEDAW, UN Women, and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights back at the beginning of the summit. And in that statement, they called upon the UN General Assembly to attend to the distinct needs of women and girls in their work at the UN. They also asked for participation of migrant and refugee women to, quote, respond to their rights and specific needs to ensure that no one's left behind. And this joint statement is an important statement, but we have to move to then actualize some of the goals and ideals in our everyday practice, be it here at home around refugee resettlement or in other places where we might be supporting refugees. So if we think about women's economic empowerment in the context of forced migration, there's a lot less said within the literature and within advocacy around what this actually looks like. Now, of course, the international humanitarian and social development regimes have turned to addressing livelihoods of refugees as they've shifted from more of an emergency humanitarian model to recognition that a large proportion of those who are on the move will actually be outside their home countries for a very long period of time, that they won't return quickly to their home countries. Yet addressing the economic rights of refugees, including accessing livelihoods and sustainable income generation beyond the emergency aid, has been a source of considerable contention at all levels. So everybody knows that livelihoods need to happen, but there are very particular politics in each country where refugees are residing, whether in or outside of camps. So UN agencies such as UNHCR, or the UN Development Program, local and international NGOs working with refugees have committed greater resources to employment programs that benefit refugee women and girls. But really, these are still a drop in the bucket compared to the scale of need. Everyday politics of social development and the economy in the host communities present significant challenges, and funding for even basic forms of assistance, cash assistance, in-kind support, let alone extensive training and work programs, is inadequate in most contexts. And this is certainly the case in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. And I'll just give you a small example. In Jordan, depending on which urban community you live in, per individual per month, you are able to secure a cash benefit of between $35 and $45. Housing is costly in Jordan. Even if you have a family of 5 or 6, you may not be able to cover your housing costs. And that's the direct cash assistance. Very, very minimal supports for individuals who are living in urban communities, much as an undocumented migrant might, or within camp settings. Of course, it's widely understood that women are impacted by forced displacement in particularly gendered ways. And refugee women often bear the responsibility of care work in the family, which isn't generally counted as work, even while facing exclusion from formal work programs fostered by humanitarian actors, or they face exploitative forms of work in informal sectors. And again, I want to signal that the panelists are going to talk about various examples today. I will just be presenting work that's based on Syrian refugees in camp settings in Jordan. So just to draw attention to the kind of scope and the scale, I think this map makes the point again that I had said in passing, that although most of the media covers the migration crisis in Europe, actually the vast majority of the supports for Syrian refugees are in the 3 neighboring countries surrounding it. So you have to keep this in mind as you think about long-term livelihoods and economic empowerment of Syrian women. The scope of the crisis is well beyond those who are displaced, and I think this is something that's very easy to forget as well. When you work on refugees and forced migration, you sometimes forget that the most vulnerable people are the people who couldn't move in the first place out of their home country. And so UNHCR defines 13.5 million people, 13.5 million Syrians in need of humanitarian assistance, and both displaced out of country and displaced within Syria, that comes with profound economic costs. So 85% are estimated to live in poverty today, and 7 million Syrians are estimated to be food insecure. There are almost 5 million people living in Syria currently in war conditions, and another 4.8 million who are registered as refugees. Keep in mind that 1.2 million have applied for asylum in Europe. That's a large number, but remember the size of Europe. Remember the capacity, the wealth of Europe in comparison with the countries that neighbor Syria. Now I'm just going to hone in a little bit on Jordan. When I step away, can you still hear me? Okay. So these numbers are political. The Jordanian government argues that 1.3 million Syrians are in Jordan, and in a country with a population of 6.6 million, that's a considerable proportion of the population overall. About 660,000 Syrians are registered with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and in the UNHCR's language, they're identified as persons of concern. The World Bank has estimated a relatively low figure of the impact on Jordan's economy as being about $2.5 billion annually. And we know that there has not been good research to actually examine what are the economic inputs and contributions of the Syrians annually. That's research that's going to be forthcoming in coming years. And I should just point out that the camp I'm going to talk about, Zatari, is right on the border there. So women's economic empowerment is interconnected with other women's rights concerns. And certainly there are a host of concerns that existed even prior to displacement from Syria. But some of the problems that might have existed within Syrian communities are exacerbated, heightened, made more difficult in situations of dislocation. Access to education remains one of the greatest challenges, both in and out of camps in Jordan, as well as in the other neighboring countries, Lebanon and Syria. We heard time and again that early marriage, while practiced in the communities of southern Syria prior to the war, that early marriage is much more common today in the camps and in communities as a survival mechanism. And that child labor is one of the issues that most concern mothers and fathers in terms of their own children's well-being. So not only is education less available, but families are resorting to strategies to raise income through children working. And part of that is because it's difficult to gain work authorization permits, and there's a perception that if children work, they're less likely to be rounded up or punished in some way. And, you know, the risk of being caught working without a permit is pretty high. One of the ways in which you can be punished in Jordan for working without authorization is actually to be moved from an urban setting into a camp. So, you know, if you're caught without the work permit, if someone reports on you, if you're doing a job that's particularly threatening to others within those communities to have you doing, you can then get yourself and your family relocated to the camps. All of the ordinary facets of life are compounded. So some of the legal aid activists and NGOs who are working in Zaatari and Azraq argue that rates of divorce are higher than they had been prior to families residing in camps, that rates of gender-based violence through self-report are higher, and that access to justice is challenging. Income generation is possible, but as I've already pointed out, it's not adequate. And there are much higher rates of male participation in the limited forms of income generation than for women. This is troubling given that there are a large number of female-headed households, especially in the camps, and so programs should be prioritizing income generation amongst those families. And then it goes without saying, but really must be stressed, and I think you'll see this from some of the photos at the camp, that access to health care, housing, food, sanitation, and water are crucial to well-being. During the hottest months of summer and during the coldest months of winter, basic functioning is really impaired just by the climate. And so being able to work is impacted by overheating or being too cold during the winter. And so I'm just highlighting here that there is much more of a focus on gender and gender mainstreaming within humanitarian and social development work around the crisis. An early study on gender-based violence and child protection done by UN Women in 2013 already identified many of the barriers that continue to be experienced by women and their families today. Human Rights Watch has been one of the most significant voices in trying to highlight access to education as critical for the Syrian communities in Jordan, Turkey, and in Lebanon, and in none of those countries is it a seamless process or adequate. And then there's been much more of a turn in the work in Jordan. I know less about Lebanon, but know that these programs are funded as well, toward what we might call social work, psychosocial support, and empowerment, civic engagement activities. Interestingly enough, many of these activities are being sponsored by a legal aid organization that's taken on much more of a social work role in the last 5 years, which I'll mention a bit later. So I wanted to provide just a few examples of economic empowerment, and I know that I sound a little bit gloomy. These are important examples, but they really resemble to me social welfare efforts in the United States, where at a state level you get your block grant around TANF, you decide to innovate a few programs at the pilot level, and then you never scale up, even when they're promising, because the funding is just not there. And the circumstances in Jordan very much resemble that same process to me. So there's innovation, there are important pilot projects that are carried out, but then the adequate funding to make sure that these kinds of programs are available to all is never put in place. Jordan, learning through his experience of hosting a large number of Iraqi refugees from about 2006 on, has put a mandate into all of its international funded efforts that half of the services need to be provided for Jordanians and half of the services need to be provided for Syrians. So you'll see in the economic empowerment activities that are funded by the international community or by the Jordanian government, the beneficiaries are always equally split between Syrians and Jordanians. They regard this as really critical and important, especially for urban refugees, to help foster a sense that the state hasn't abandoned low-income Jordanians. Many low-income Jordanians are in very similar situations to the Syrians who have come to stay in the country. So some examples of work. There have been a number of work permits that have been opened for Syrians through really sustained advocacy, and about 40,000 work permits have been issued to date. This still pales in comparison to the number of work permits that Egyptians have. There are about 200,000 work permits for Egyptians, largely in the construction sector. But this is a marked improvement over the experience with Iraqi refugees. Of those work permits, 35% are in the agricultural sector. So picking tomatoes, growing crops, working with animal husbandry. About 15% is in wholesale and retail, another 15% in hospitality and food services. Notably, Syrian women have received only 5% of the work permits that have been accorded to Syrians overall. So 95% have gone to men, 5% to women. Now, there are some economic empowerment projects for Syrians and Jordanian women. One by the Food and Agricultural Organization has trained women in farming practices and food security. Whether or not those lead to actual jobs is another matter. This project just took place last year and served a total of 555 women. Again, an example of a pilot project ready to scale up. In collaboration with the Jordan River Foundation, UN Women supported strengthening 8 community-based organizations in Mafraq, which enabled them to open up about 300 micro-businesses. That's a very new project, so evaluation hasn't been done to see the sustainability of that micro-enterprise. And women are being trained to work in the garment sector, both Jordanian and Syrian women working alongside one another. Such programming is much more limited and constrained in camp settings such as Zatari. So with, I see that we're starting to get close on time, Marciana. 10 minutes? Okay. So I want to take us into the camp. So the examples I just talked about are taking place within host community settings, and about 1 in 6 Syrian refugees in Jordan lives in a camp. The rest live outside. Zatari is very close to the Syrian border, about 10 to 15 miles away. And it's the largest refugee camp in Jordan. A second camp, Azraq, began construction a couple of years ago, and the plans for Azraq are to have it be max about 120,000 refugees. The majority of these refugees are from the neighboring province right on the other side of the border, and the majority of them are young. So think about that issue around access to education. 60% of the refugees are under age 18. You also, it's important to note that this is a closed camp, so you need permission both to go in and to go out, and this is a matter of contention for the refugees. They would like to have much more open ability to move in and out of the camp, in part for livelihoods, in part because they're living in a very constrained space. If you take the literal meaning of the word, they are concentrated in a space with barbed wire. It's about 5 kilometers squared. It's a large city, which you can't leave or can't come into without permission. As the Arab Renaissance for Democracy and Development puts it, and they're one of the few local Jordanian NGOs that has access to working in the camp, they argue that the population of the camp is living in extremely difficult circumstances. Many live in overcrowded accommodation with minimal financial resources, few opportunities to work, and are not able to leave the camp. There are negotiations underway currently to try to open up the restrictions around movement within the camp. So you should know that people are working on this, both local Jordanian advocates, the aid workers for ARD, the social workers and the legal aid activists were continually trying to struggle with this issue about whether or not the camps were a good thing. So you could hear, even in the activist voices, some anxiety over what it would mean to completely open up the camps and what were the long-term human rights consequences of basically making these camps permanent. This very much is a camp city. Both Azraq and Zaatari are planned. You can go on Google Maps and check them out. You can see the planned streets right from Google Maps. You can see the sites where new units will be placed. And importantly, there's a dynamic informal economy which is actually supported by camp governance. The camp is run by UNHCR and other UN agencies along with the Jordanian government. And one of the first things that sprung up when the camp was created in 2012 was a small market street, which is now closer to 5 market streets and some 3,000 shops. Currency is diverse, pluralistic, so both Syrian currency, Jordanian dinars, and euros and dollars are all used within the camp. There's also a barter economy that's ongoing. So the refugee communities in Al-Zaatari have developed mechanisms to cope with life in the camp for the longer term. There's a sense that this camp is here to stay. Although refugees in Jordan can work only under very limited conditions, residents have developed income-generating activities. And it should be noted that of these small markets, 96% of the employees are male and 4% are female. So again, there's a strong bias toward male-run business, male-run entrepreneurship, and a need for the camp community to provide more opportunities for women to develop their own entrepreneurial activities. I'm going to skip over the school and I want to highlight that people are incredibly creative. One of the biggest part of a woman or a girl's life is actually doing laundry, making sure there's water to take care of the household needs. And until recently, most of these units did not have bathrooms or toilets. There are now, through the Norwegian Refugee Council, there are efforts to retrofit all of the units with small chemical toilets, which is a massive improvement given that women did not want to travel to the communal toilets or walk to the communal toilets at night out of fear for their own security. You get the sense that maybe men designed the camp? Water is one of the most challenging problems, and in focus groups, access to water ends up being a top concern. You can see on this water tank the hoses that are going off. You are allowed to bring a hose to your unit, but you shouldn't be doing a lot of laundry, although people have washing machines in their units now. They have access to local electricity, either generated in their units or through the camp. But you're not allowed to grow a garden. So water use is a really huge issue. The water is pretty much all shipped in on semi-trucks. And so most families do not have any greenery around them. And they're not able to grow their own plants. Despite that, there are creative efforts to make the space green. And actually there's a graffiti co-op within the camp, especially kind of serving the interests of youth who are in charge of going around and trying to beautify the camp. You can see here one of the sewer outtakes. According to World Health Organization standards, this is mighty close to this housing unit. So a last few words, and then I'll leave a slide up for us to maybe think about toward the end of the panel discussion. There's a new program which very much fits in a neoliberal model of welfare called Cash for Work. It might sound a little bit like the workfare programs of TANF. There are some resemblances. And in the camp, there are not enough slots for the amount of demand. So there are rotating 6,500 work slots. The large majority of those slots go to men, and the large majority of those jobs are actually to work in the sanitation sector of the camp or in building roads or other infrastructure. Women do get some of the cash for work positions, and I'd just like to highlight a couple of them. So garment making, sewing uniforms for children in the schools, or sewing the baby kits for UNICEF, for example, repurposing old tents as housing units get replaced to create durable shopping bags, some work in education, and work within some of the 27 community centers within the camp. The Cash for Work program is one of the most commented upon issues within the regular focus groups run by different sectors of camp administration. And it's interesting to note in one of the most recent rounds in which they were doing strategic planning through 2020, I think you get a sense that they think this is going to be around for a while, that there's a pretty big disparity between what was reported around the men's focus group and what was reported around the women's focus groups. And I heard this time and again from the legal aid actors, a sense amongst men that programming is too skewed toward women, focuses too much on women's rights and women's empowerment, and indeed generated by this recent round of focus groups in 2016, men's groups asserted that women's rights were already secure. There was enough work being done there, and that work should be addressed more toward developing more appropriate and meaningful work for men. The women's focus groups identified a range of issues, at least as reported in camp governance document. First of all, a need to access work permits, and a desire to be able to move in and out of the camps, to have mobility. For better transportation systems within camps, you actually have to pay for the bus that goes around camps, and sometimes that's a costly item. Some service providers, they felt, treated them with disrespect, so there was a need for training amongst service providers about how to work with women and families. And one of the items of deep concern for women in the focus groups was higher rates of child marriage and child labor concerns. When we started the work with Iraqi refugees back in the late 2007, 2008, there were royal NGOs that were doing some initial work on behalf of Iraqis. In the decades since that Iraqi refugee migration crisis, there have been a lot more development in terms of local NGOs. And one of the most, I think, active and innovative has been the Arab Renaissance for Democracy and Development. I suggest you go on their Facebook page, you like them, you follow their work. They maintain both Arabic and English engagement. And they take a high number of interns globally, including from Europe and from the United States, to help support their work. They're involved in the kinds of things that we would think of the ordinary, everyday life of social work as well. And legal teams in the camp provide advice and a measure of access to justice for women and family members when they're seeking support or help around divorce, inheritance, registering a birth, registering a marriage, and other ordinary aspects of life. So I am going to stop here with the notion that we, within the field, whether we're educators or practitioners, have a lot of creative thinking to do about what our role is within situations of large-scale migration, and both to help build capacity and gender-responsive programming, to encourage camp administrators who are well-steeped and trained in gender responsiveness to be more innovative in their approaches to providing access to training and work, and also to really press the international community to refuse to underfund these programs. There's radical underfunding for all of them, and food insecurity remains a problem even within the refugee camps, even within the closed spaces that people can't get outside of. And then the last point would be that we as social workers, I'll never forget a Turkish gentleman who spoke to me in the midst of the Iraq War when the US was occupying. And he said, you know, it's great that you're here studying child poverty in Turkey. That's important and all. But it would really, really help if you would just go home and do advocacy in your own country. If you could do more to shape just policies in your own country, that would help us a lot. And I kind of take that message as a takeaway message for us here today.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine. And